There is a house on Brook Street, in the heart of the Mayfair district of London, number 69, a tall, respectable townhouse of the kind that housed the men who ran an empire. And in the small, dark hours of the 24th of February 1922, a servant climbed the stairs to wake the master of that house, and found that he would not wake. Lewis Harcourt, first Viscount Harcourt, one of the most powerful liberal politicians of his entire generation, a man who had personally governed the colonies of the largest empire the world had ever seen, was dead in his own bed at the age of 59. On the table beside the bed sat a bottle of bromidia, a sleeping draught his doctor had prescribed. The official cause of death would be recorded, in time after an inquest, as a dose that had gone wrong, heart failure, a sudden and fatal flooding of the lungs, a tragic accident of medicine and nothing more. That is what the inquest would formally conclude. That is what the family and the party and the whole class he belonged to needed the inquest to conclude. But in the drawing rooms of London society, where the truth always travelled faster and more freely than any coroner's careful verdict, they were already passing the other word between them behind their hands, suicide, and underneath that word sat a second word, uglier and far more dangerous than the first. The reason a Viscount and former Secretary of State might swallow enough sleeping draught to make certain he never woke again, because a boy of 13, an Eton schoolboy, had spoken. And what that boy, said Lewis Harcourt, had done to him, was about to reach exactly the wrong ears, was about to break out of the private whisper and into the daylight of the public world. And the man that everyone in society called Lulu understood, better and more precisely than any other living person, exactly what that exposure was going to cost him. He understood it so well that he chose, if the whispers were true, to be dead before the Morning Post could bring it to his door. Skewskers to the Gilded Cage and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every one of them. Because the woman at the true center of this story, the wife who slept somewhere under that same roof on Brook Street and knew none of it, is the person that almost every single account of this scandal forgets entirely. The history books, obsessed as they always are with the important men, made this the story of Lewis Harcourt and his secret and his death. But she is the one I want you to remember when the video ends tonight, because she is the only person in the whole affair who did nothing wrong and paid for it anyway. Her name was Mary Ethel Burns, and she had spent 23 years being the flawless and admired wife of a monster. She never for one moment knew she had married, and to understand how a woman that intelligent, that sharp-eyed, that formidably well-connected, could live pressed up beside this man for more than 2 decades and never once see the truth of him, you have to first understand the sheer size and the deep, deliberate blindness of the world she had come from. Mary was American and Mary was Morgan money, which in that age was to say she stood as close to the raw center of global financial power as any woman alive. Her father was Walter Hayes Burns, an American banker who had risen to become a partner in the House of Morgan and to run its enormously important London operation. And her mother was Mary Lyman Morgan. And that name in the middle is the whole point of everything, because Mary Morgan was the sister of John Pierpont Morgan himself, J.P. Morgan, the single most powerful financier the modern world had yet produced, the man who bailed out the government of the United States when it ran short of gold. Mary Ethel Burns was J.P. Morgan's own niece. She was not, understand, a scrambling and anxious dollar princess, one of the second-tier heiresses sent across the ocean by an ambitious mother to trade new money for an old title she could barely afford. She was something grander and more secure than that. She was one of the wealthiest and best-connected young women on either side of the Atlantic, a woman for whom a viscount was, if anything, a step the family need not have troubled itself to take. And when she married, She brought into the ancient Harcourt family a set of jewels so famous, so storied, that they carried their own name down through the generations. The Harcourt emeralds. Remember those emeralds, because they are going to be the truest and most durable thing in this entire story. They are the one object that came into that marriage clean and stayed clean and outlasted every human being who touched them, while everything soft and human around them slowly rotted from the inside. That was Mary's world, the world that formed her. Old banking, deep, secure, generational money. The unshakable and inherited confidence of a family that had never once, in any member's living memory, been told the word no. And it is precisely that confidence, that bone-deep certainty that people like the Morgans and the Harcourts simply existed above and beyond the reach of ordinary suspicion, that allowed the monster to hide in the plainest possible sight for the entire length of the marriage. Nobody investigates a viscount, nobody questions the private life of the man who governs the colonies of an empire. The armor of Lewis Harcourt's public respectability was so thick and so complete that it ended up protecting not the innocent but the guilty, and it protected him faithfully and totally for 23 long years. The blueprint of disaster now. Let me introduce you properly to the man Mary married, because Lewis Vernon Harcourt was, on paper and in public, one of the most impeccable and enviable Englishmen alive in his day. He was born in January of 1863 at Newnham Courtenay, the great Harcourt's seat in the Green Heart of Oxfordshire, the son of Sir William Harcourt, himself a towering figure of Victorian politics, Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man who came within arm's reach of becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain. Lewis, then, was raised from infancy at the very centre of English political power, moving among the men, her and the country, before he was old enough to shave. Everyone who knew him called him Lulu, a soft and affectionate childhood nickname that clung to him all his life and had the effect, perhaps not entirely by accident, of making a grown and powerful man sound gentle and harmless and small. He became, in his own right, a Liberal Member of Parliament, sitting for the constituency of Rossendale. He rose to become First Commissioner of Works, the man responsible for the public buildings and parks of the nation, and then he rose higher still, to become Secretary of State for the colonies from 1910 to 1915, one of the truly great offices of the British Empire, the minister who administered vast territories and tens of millions of lives across the globe. In 1917, the Crown made him Viscount Harcourt, raising him into the peerage in his own name. He lovingly restored the great house at Newnham. He was cultured, charming, endlessly well-connected, a collector and a host and a fixture at every table that mattered. And he was trusted at the very highest levels of the British government. He married Mary Burns on the 1st of July, 1899, and together the two of them became one of the model couples of Edwardian high society, the American banking heiress and the rising English statesman, the famous emeralds at her throat, and the machinery of the empire in his capable hands. And every single piece of that glittering picture was a front, a painted stage flat with nothing behind it. Because in the private, whispered knowledge of London society, spoken of behind closed doors, but never once printed in any newspaper, Lewis Harcourt was something that the polite language of his time barely had the words to describe. He was a sexual predator who preyed upon the young, and the surviving record is chilling and specific in making clear that his appetites did not confine themselves to any single kind of victim. If you have ever wondered how a predator manages to survive and operate for decades inside a respectable and admired family, stay very close to me here, because the mechanism of it is the real horror at the heart of this story, and it is, disturbingly, the same mechanism that still protects men like him now, a full century later. Subscribe if you want the full anatomy of how the powerful concealed these crimes, because what allowed Lulu Harcourt to operate in plain sight was not, in the end, cunning or cleverness on his part. It was the flat, collective, self-interested unwillingness of everyone around him to believe what a part of them could plainly see. And the evidence of what Harcourt truly was does not come to us from idle tabloid rumor or from malicious gossip after the fact. It comes directly from his victims and from the people who knew and believed them. Dorothy Brett, the daughter of Viscount Esher, who was himself one of the most influential courtiers and advisers in the whole kingdom, later became a painter and eventually fled England altogether to join the artists' colony at Taos in New Mexico. And Dorothy Brett wrote about Lewis Harcourt in words that leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. She described him attempting to sexually assault her when she was still a young girl, and she wrote of him with a bluntness that was genuinely rare and genuinely brave for a woman of her sheltered class and repressed era. She called him a sex maniac in plain words. She wrote that he was as bad with boys as he was with girls, that it was, in her own devastating phrase, just ungovernable sex desire for both sexes. Sit for a moment with the sheer weight of the fact that a woman of that class, that period, and that upbringing felt compelled to take up a pen and write those exact sentences down on paper about a sitting cabinet minister of the British Empire. That is not gossip. That is a survivor naming her attacker in the only language and the only forum that her powerless position ever allowed her. Dorothy Brett knew exactly what he was. Others within that closed and glittering world knew, or half knew, or knew and made themselves forget. And still the great machinery of respectability turned smoothly on. And still Lulu Harcourt kept his honoured seat at every dinner table that mattered in London. And still Mary, his wife, arranged the flowers and greeted the guests and wore the emeralds and had not the faintest idea that the charming and celebrated man she had built her whole life around was the precise thing that the whispers behind the fans described. So how, mechanically, does the plan of concealment actually work, year after year after year? It works because the victims are so often children, and children are not believed by a world that does not wish to believe them. It works because the accusers who survive to adulthood are girls, and girls are told, gently or firmly, that they must have misunderstood or imagined or provoked it. It works because the man at the center is a viscount and a minister, and a viscount's word outweighs a schoolboy's word by the entire crushing weight of the social order stacked behind it. Harcourt never needed to construct a clever, elaborate scheme to hide himself. The scheme was the culture itself, every single institution arranged around him, the political party that needed his talents, the great families that dined with him, the schools that trusted their boys to men of his rank, the newspapers held silent by the savage libel laws of the day. All of it was engineered, whether by design or by cowardice, to make his particular kind of crime literally unspeakable. And a crime that cannot even be spoken aloud is a crime that cannot be investigated, cannot be charged, and cannot be stopped. For more than 20 years, that vast conspiracy of silence held firm. Mary lived her entire married life at the innocent dead center of it, the unknowing heart of a house built over a hidden fault, projecting to all the watching world a picture of flawless aristocratic domesticity, never once suspecting that the domesticity itself was the disguise, and that she was the most convincing part of it. The unraveling every wall of silence, however thick, has a single stone somewhere in it that gives way first. And in this story that stone was a boy named Edward James today, if the name Edward James means anything at all to you, it is almost certainly because Edward James grew up to become one of the most important and generous patrons of surrealist art anywhere in the world. The man who funded and befriended Salvador Dali and René Magritte, who commissioned dreamlike masterpieces and built extraordinary fantastical houses and lived a strange, brilliant, wounded life at the edge of the modern art movement. But in the cold winter of 1922, Edward James was none of those things yet. He was a 13-year-old Eton schoolboy, a child, and he made an accusation. He said plainly, that Lewis Harcourt had made a sexual advance upon him. And here is where the second crucial figure quietly enters the story and changes everything, because the boy's mother did not do the thing that so very many mothers of that world had done before her, which was to bury the shame in silence in order to protect the powerful man and the family's own name. Edward James's mother took her son's story and she carried it out into society, and she made certain that the people who mattered heard it. This is the loose thread of the whole careful web of concealment, and I want you to understand exactly how thin that single thread was, and at the same time exactly how much it threatened to unravel. In the tight, enclosed, incestuous world of the English aristocracy, a spoken accusation originating from within the right kind of family, carried by the right kind of well-placed woman into the right kind of drawing rooms, could accomplish precisely the thing that no newspaper in the land had ever dared to do. It could not, on its own, send Harcourt to prison, not without a criminal trial that would have publicly ruined a dozen great families in the process and dragged a child through hell. But it could destroy him socially, completely and permanently. And everyone who moved in that world understood, without anyone ever needing to say it, that social destruction, for a man like Lewis Harcourt, whose entire being was staked on his standing, was a form of death sentence in its own right, because a public scandal of this precise kind would not stay politely contained within England. Mary was a Morgan. The story, once it broke free, would cross the Atlantic on the next fast liner. It would reach the roaring newspapers of 2 continents at once. The former Secretary of State, who had governed an empire, the husband of the House of Morgan, exposed to the entire literate world as a predator of small boys and young girls. There was no version of that exposure, none, in which Lewis Harcourt survived with anything at all left intact. The hunters in this story then were not the police. Scotland Yard never came marching up the steps of the house on Brook Street. There was no dawn arrest, no detective with a warrant, no handcuffs in the hall. The hunter was the whisper itself, the story moving quietly and relentlessly from mouth to mouth to mouth through the dining rooms and card rooms of Mayfair, gathering weight and detail and certainty as it went. And Harcourt, who was a political animal down to the very marrow of his bones, a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms and measuring the temperature of opinion, would have felt that whisper closing in around him in exactly the way a man feels the air go cold and heavy before a great storm finally breaks. He had spent his whole career reading which way the wind of reputation was blowing and positioning himself always on the safe side of it. He had watched other men, lesser men, fall when the wind turned against them. He knew, with a terrible and precise professional clarity that few of his victims could have matched, exactly what the steady spread of Edward James's accusation through society truly meant for him. He knew that the very machinery of silence that had faithfully protected him for more than 20 years could reverse itself in a single season, and become, instead, the machinery of his total annihilation. He knew that the same society which refused to speak of these things aloud in order to protect its own would, the very moment that concealment became impossible, turn as one and devour the guilty man in order to protect itself. And in the middle of all of it, still always was Mary. There is an almost unbearable poignancy in trying to imagine what she actually perceived across those final weeks and days. Did she notice her husband growing distant and distracted and afraid at his own table? Did she catch the frayed edge of a whisper at a dinner party? A conversation that stopped a beat too quickly when she entered the room, and dismiss it in her own mind as impossible, unthinkable, because the man being spoken of was Lulu, her Lulu, the father of her 4 children, the man she had shared a bed and a life and a name with for more than 2 decades. The historical record does not tell us, And I want to flag that gap honestly for you, because it is the great and painful silence sitting at the very center of this story. We know in considerable detail what society knew. We do not know, and we may never know, what Mary knew, or when she came to know it, or whether she in fact went to her own grave nearly 40 years later, still faithfully believing in the sad accident of the sleeping draught by the bedside. History recorded the predator in unsparing detail, and it left the wife, the innocent party, a near-total blank, and that blank, that erasure of her inner life, is its own distinct and quiet cruelty. Layered on top of all the others, the spectacle, the panic when it finally broke entirely inward. Harcourt did not flee the country in the night. He did not bluster or threaten or hire lawyers to intimidate his accusers into silence. He did instead the thing that a certain kind of cornered man does when he has coldly calculated every possible exit and has found, one after another, that every one of them is sealed shut against him. On the night of the 23rd of February 1922, in his bedroom in the house on Brook Street, he took the bromidia, the sleeping draught his doctor had prescribed him, and, if the persistent rumors that swept society were true, he took a great deal more of it than any doctor had ever prescribed. Enough that he did not wake. In the morning the household found him, 59 years old, a Viscount of the realm, a former Secretary of State for the colonies, dead in his own bed in the heart of fashionable Mayfair, with the whisper of a 13-year-old schoolboy's accusation still moving quietly through the city just outside his shuttered window, as the news went out across London and then across the wires to the wider world. I want you to ask yourself which version of the story the world was permitted to have, and more importantly, who exactly decided that. Because if you have ever followed how the powerful move to control the shape of the narrative, even in death, especially in death, then subscribe and stay with me. Because what the inquest did in the days that followed is a genuine masterclass in the quiet machinery of the cover-up. An inquest was held as the law required into the sudden death of so prominent a man, and the inquest returned a verdict of death by misadventure. The cause was given in careful and clinical language as heart failure and a sudden oedema, a flooding, of the lungs, brought on by the dose of bromidia. The coroner, by the surviving accounts of the proceeding, treated the very suggestion of suicide as something close to an offence against decency, dismissing the idea, in effect, as grotesque, as simply unthinkable for a man of Harcourt's rank and standing and public service. And so the official record was sealed shut with the kindest and most convenient possible lie. Not a predator run to ground and cornered by the truth, not a suicide swallowed in the dark to escape a coming scandal about children. Merely a tired and distinguished public servant who had taken his prescribed medicine and slipped quietly away in his sleep. The empire buried one of its own administrators with full honor and solemnity, and the whisper that had actually killed him was not permitted anywhere near the official page of history. This is the high society blacklist working, remarkably, in reverse, where the con-man earls and the exposed fortune hunters of that world were quietly abandoned by their class, and left to sink. Lewis Harcourt was quietly and firmly protected by his, because protecting Harcourt was, in the cold final analysis, the same act as protecting themselves. To let the true reason for his death be spoken aloud would have been to admit that a man at the very apex of respectable British life, a cabinet minister, a peer, had been a monster of the worst imaginable kind, and that everyone who had dined with him and served alongside him and trusted their sons near him and married their daughters into his circle had either not known, which was an embarrassment, or had known and said nothing, which was a complicity too terrible to look at directly. The reputation being so carefully defended in that inquest room was never really Harcourt's own reputation at all. It was the reputation of the entire structure, the whole gilded class, that had housed and honored him, And so the great families closed ranks, not around the man himself, who was already dead and past saving, but around the silence that his death demanded. And that silence held so completely and so successfully that the true reason for Lewis Harcourt's death would remain entirely unknown to the wider British public for the next 50 years. Half a century of suspense. The accusation that a 13-year-old boy first made in the winter of 1922 did not reach the general public in any real way until the 1970s, when the slow passage of time and the changing of the entire moral world finally, allowed the story to be told out loud. Consider, for a moment, what that 50-year silence actually cost, and precisely who was made to pay for it. It did not, in the end, protect the victims, who had already been harmed, and who were left to carry the memory of that harm privately for the whole of their remaining lives, unacknowledged and unavenged. It did not deliver any measure of justice, because the man himself was dead and gone and forever beyond the reach of any earthly court. What the great silence protected in truth was comfort, nothing nobler than that, the comfort of a ruling class that did not wish to know what one of its own most honored members had been. And the person that the silence arguably failed most completely of all was the one single person in the whole affair who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Mary. Because a woman whose husband dies of a sad heart complaint in his sleep is a respectable widow, to be pitied and honored and invited still to every table. The truth would have made her into something else entirely, something soiled by association through no fault of her own, and the family's iron silence, whatever else it did or failed to do, kept her at least inside the more bearable of the two stories. The verdict and the voice, what, then, happened to the wife once the long performance was finally over and the man at the center of it was in his grave? Here is the place in the story where Mary Ethel Burns at last steps out from the deep shadow of her husband and becomes, finally, the true center of her own life, and it is a quietly and genuinely remarkable thing to watch her do it. Mary did not collapse. She did not retreat into invalidism or vanish from public life into grief and shame. She had, in fact, already built for herself a substantial public identity that was entirely her own, one that owed nothing whatsoever to Lulu's crimes or even to his career. During the terrible years of the First World War, while her husband's political star was in fact fading, Mary had thrown herself into serious and sustained charitable and organizational work, the kind of demanding wartime service that took real ability and real stamina, and she had been recognized for it in her own right. She was appointed a Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John, and then, in 1918, 4 full years before her husband's death and his secret ever surfaced, she was made a Dame Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire, the highest rank of that order, one of the most significant honors that the entire country could bestow upon a woman. That honor was hers, and hers alone. It was earned by her own hands and her own labor, not borrowed or reflected from her husband's name or her uncle's fortune. And so when Lewis died and left her a widow, standing at the very center of a dark secret she may in fact never have fully understood, Mary Harcourt already had ground of her own to stand upon, ground she had built herself, stone by stone, entirely apart from him. And she lived on for nearly 4 full decades after him. Mary Ethel, Viscountess Harcourt, died on the 7th of January 1961, having outlived her husband by an astonishing 39 years, having raised their 4 children to adulthood, having carried the Harcourt name with dignity through nearly 4 decades in which she, and emphatically not he, was its living public representative. And this is exactly where the emeralds return to the story, as I promised you they would. Those famous Harcourt emeralds had come into the ancient family in the first place through Mary, through her Morgan blood and her vast American fortune. They were, in the very coldest and most honest accounting, a part of the price of the marriage, the treasure that the old English family had gained by taking in the wealthy banker's daughter from across the sea. But Mary outlasted the marriage. She outlasted the man who had married her under false pretenses. She outlasted the whispered scandal and the sealed inquest and the 50-year silence itself. And the emeralds stayed throughout all of it, exactly what they had always been, hers by origin, hers by blood, hers by right, a set of hard, bright, incorruptible facts that survived intact, while the soft and rotten secret at the center of the marriage did its slow work in the dark. The jewels came into that house clean, and they stayed clean the whole way through, while the man who had married them turned out to be the flawed and corrupted thing all along. There is a bitter kind of justice folded into that, if you look for it. The collateral damage of the whole affair, though, is real, and I will not paper over it or tidy it away for the sake of a clean ending. There were 4 children who grew up as the sons and daughters of Lewis Harcourt, one of whom, William, in due course inherited the viscountcy and carried the title and the name forward into the next generation. Those children inherited a name and a rank, and then, eventually, when the wall of silence finally cracked and crumbled in the 1970s, they inherited something far heavier, the public truth of what their father had actually been, a truth that their mother may well have been spared, and that they, living into a more open age, were not. There were the victims, Edward James and Dorothy Brett and the others whose names never once entered any official record at all, children of the aristocracy, who carried the private weight of what Harcourt did to them for decades in silence, because the world they lived in had built no place at all where such a thing could be set down and named. Edward James, as I told you, channeled his strange and damaged brilliance into the dream worlds of surrealism and became a legend of the modern art world. And one wonders always quietly how much of that lifelong flight into painted dreams and fantastical houses first began in a cold and waking reality that no adult in his world would let him name aloud. The damage did not die with Harcourt in his bed on Brook Street. It scattered outward, silently, into a dozen private lives, and it stayed lodged there, in each of them, for the rest of their days. And the man himself, exiled even in death, got the single thing that his overdose, if that is what it was, had been meant to buy him. He got the silence, he escaped the trials he so richly deserved, and the prison cell, and the roaring newspapers of 2 continents, and the slow public ruin of watching his own honored name become, in headline after headline, a byword for the very worst thing that a man can be, he purchased, with a fatal measure of bromidia, in the dark 50 full years of protected and unblemished reputation. It is the darkest and coldest bargain in this entire story, and he made it utterly alone, in the middle of the night, in a fine house on Brook Street, while his innocent wife slept somewhere under the very same roof, entirely unaware of every part of it. Step back now and consider carefully what this long and successful concealment truly tells us, because in the end this was never really a story about one uniquely wicked man. It is a story about a whole system that was engineered, whether deliberately or through sheer accumulated cowardice, to protect him. The historians and the researchers who eventually pieced together the real truth of Lewis Harcourt, working patiently from Dorothy Brett's surviving written accounts, from the recollections of Edward James, and from the great collection of archived Harcourt papers now held in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, did not uncover the story of a single lone predator who had somehow brilliantly fooled absolutely everyone around him. What they uncovered was something far more damning and far more useful to understand. They uncovered a predator whom a great many people in his own world had suspected all along, and whom the entire architecture of Edwardian respectability had been quietly arranged to shield from consequence. The real lesson of Lewis Harcourt is not the comforting fiction that evil is clever and hides itself well. It is the far more uncomfortable truth that evil, when it happens to wear the right title, and marry the right money, and govern the right empire, does not actually have to hide itself very hard at all. because the frightened and self-interested people all around it will do the hard work of the hiding for it, in order to protect themselves, and what stands today where the Harcourt world once ruled so confidently. Newnham House, the great Oxfordshire seat where Lulu was born and which he restored with such loving care, still stands above the slow curve of the River Thames, though it long ago passed out of the family's daily life and into other hands and other uses. The house survives its master. The title itself, Viscount Harcourt, passed on his death to his son William, and then, when William in his own time died without a male heir of his body to follow him, the viscountcy simply went extinct, the line stopping dead, the name closing quietly like a door swinging shut in an empty room. And that closing is genuinely worth pausing over for a moment, because it means that the viscountcy which Lewis Harcourt had spent his whole life adorning and elevating outlived him by only a single generation before it vanished entirely from the rolls of the peerage. The emeralds, the physical treasure that Mary had brought with her into the family, are by far the more durable legacy of the two. Jewels that carry the Harcourt name down through time still, though the name that sits upon them came, in the end, and in truth, entirely from her side of the bargain. So, when everything is weighed, was justice actually served in the case of Lewis Harcourt? Here I have to give you the hard and unwelcome answer, because the comfortable one would be a lie, and you did not come this far to be lied to. No, justice was not served. A man who spent decades preying upon children was never once tried, never convicted, never so much as publicly named in his own lifetime as the thing he actually was. He chose the precise time and the manner of his own exit from the world, and he took with him into the grave the undeserved peace of a good and honored reputation that held firm for a full half-century after his death. If your idea of justice requires a courtroom and a jury, and a verdict spoken aloud, and a victim finally heard and believed in the clean light of day, then this story offers you not one single scrap of it. What it offers instead is something colder and truer, and far more useful to carry away with you, a hard, clear lesson about exactly how power protected its own in that Gilded Age, and about how very much of that protecting was done not by obvious villains twirling their mustaches, but by ordinary, decent, frightened people who simply could not bear the cost of knowing. The real tragedy here is not only that Harcourt escaped what he deserved, it is that his escape required, and received, the active or the silent cooperation of an entire so-called civilized world. But I do not want to leave you at the very end, standing over the body of Lewis Harcourt, because this was never truly his story, whatever the history books, forever fixated on the doings of important men, decided to make of it. I want to leave you instead with Mary. So picture her not on the terrible night of the death, but years and years later, an old woman now, a dame of the British Empire in her own hard-earned right, the famous emeralds resting in their case in some quiet drawer, 4 grown children and their children scattered around her, a long and full life very nearly complete. She had married a charming and brilliant man in the bright summer of 1899, fully believing that she knew exactly who and what he was. She had been wrong about him in a way that no wife should ever have to be wrong. And whether she ever learned the full and terrible truth of the man she married, whether she carried it in silence for 40 years, or was mercifully spared it entirely right to the end, she had, in the living of her long life, done the one single thing that her husband, for all his rank and power and cunning, could never do. She had built a self, a whole standing identity, that did not depend in any way upon the lie. The honors were hers, the children were hers, the emeralds were hers, and above all, the dignity was entirely hers. She had entered that grand house on her wedding day as the innocent and decorative ornament of a monster's respectable public life, and she walked out the far end of it 4 full decades on, as the only person in the whole long dark story who had never once, in all of it, had a single thing to be ashamed of. If this story stayed with you tonight, Subscribe to the Gilded Cage so that the next one finds its way to you. Share it with someone who still believes deep in their heart that a fine title or a great fortune or a spotless and admired public name tells you a single true and reliable thing about the person who wears it, because Mary Ethel Burns is the living proof of exactly how little any of it tells you, and of exactly what it can cost to learn that lesson too late. This is the Gilded Cage, where the very grandest houses always kept the darkest and most private rooms, and where the lock, more often than anyone dared to say, was fitted on the inside of the door. Some cages were built and polished to look exactly like gifts. Mary was handed hers on her wedding day, wrapped in ancient emeralds, and it took her the whole of a long lifetime to walk free of the shadow of it. But walk free she did in the end, and she did it the way she did everything, with her back straight and her honors earned and her name her own, without once ever having to raise her voice. And some lullabies, the ones we tell about the gilded and the trapped and the ones who quietly outlasted them, never truly end. This one was hers.